A physical boundary dictates access to the wreck site off the Wakimoto coast in Kagoshima Prefecture. The water is exceptionally shallow. At high tide, the depth reaches only 10 feet. At low tide, the clearance drops to a mere 3 feet. Trapped within this narrow tidal window is an N1K2J Shiden Kai, the Japanese naval interceptor known to Allied forces as the George. It has occupied this exact coastal position for 81 years. The site contains the aircraft flown by Captain Yoshishige Hayashi. He served as the commander of the 407th Fighter Squadron, operating within the 343rd Kokutai. That identification is reported by the Preservation Group and local Japanese coverage, giving the operation a working historical baseline before any extraction equipment approaches the water. It establishes who and what the team is dealing with. It does not reveal whether the submerged structure can still tolerate an engineered lift. The resting place off Akune City is not a static, deep ocean environment. It is a highly dynamic coastal surf zone. For 8 decades, the airframe has been subjected to continuous mechanical energy from tidal exchanges. The shifting sand bed constantly reorganizes itself around the aluminum structure. This exposure leaves standard marine salvage vessels with too little draft for continuous heavy crane access. The stated objective is the complete forensic extraction of the Shiden Kai for long-term structural conservation. The coastal geography turns that objective into a timed lift. Equipment can approach only at peak high tide, and any loss of clearance risks grounding above the buried wreck. Surveying the site from the surface yields limited structural data. Investigators can verify the geographic coordinates and confirm the general presence of the aircraft beneath the water. What remains disputed or entirely unknown prior to physical extraction is the exact condition of the aluminum ribs and spars buried deep within the coastal sediment. The 81-year gap means the visual perimeter of the wreck does not accurately represent the mechanical integrity of the load-bearing components. The environment constantly obscures the true state of the metal framework. Time in a coastal zone does not merely age a metal structure, it actively changes its physical parameters. The continuous movement of sand and seawater across the N1K2J Shiden Kai removes external material while introducing new unknown variables into the structural equation. That process leaves the original factory specifications unreliable for calculating the airframe as it now exists. The planning problem therefore shifts from access alone to controlled extraction under a changing load. Every structural assumption made by the planning team must account for the reality of the dynamic surf zone. The historical ledgers accurately define the machine as it existed upon its final flight. The recovery engineers must instead contend with the machine as it exists today, altered by thousands of tidal cycles. How a fragile aluminum airframe reacts to 8 decades in a coastal tidal zone fundamentally changes the engineering math of bringing it home. Japanese sources place the wreck roughly 100 to 200 meters from shore, but the story of how it arrived there matters more to its present condition. On April 21, 1945, the aircraft intercepted a formation of American B-29 bombers. During the engagement, the Shiden Kai sustained critical combat damage. This mechanical degradation forced the pilot to execute an emergency water landing. Ditching a high-speed fighter into the ocean introduces a severe fluid dynamic constraint. When an airframe strikes water, fluid drag forces the structure to decelerate abruptly on the surface. Because water does not compress to absorb the impact energy, the stopping force is immediate and violent. This rapid loss of forward speed throws internal mass forward much faster than standard restraint systems can absorb. During this ditching sequence, the pilot, a man in his mid-20s, was reportedly thrown forward against the instrument panel. Japanese accounts describe a fatal impact injury at the cockpit, but the exact biomechanical sequence cannot be reconstructed from the public record alone. Following the severe deceleration, the heavy engine and forward cockpit section settled into the shallow coastal water. The forces of the ditching sequence, followed by decades of surf and sediment movement, left the rear fuselage largely absent from the recovered structure. Today, the surviving wreckage centers on the engine, the forward cockpit area, the main wing sections, and associated components still attached or recovered nearby. After the ditching, the surviving structure became a trap for sediment. Its landing gear bays, fuel cell compartments, wing cavities, and other voids gave moving coastal water places to drive sand deep inside the airframe. Slowly, the ocean replaces some of the buoyant air inside the metal skin with dense, waterlogged sediment. As water flows in and out with the daily tides, suspended sand particles settle and compact within low internal points of the structure. Over 8 decades, this continuous mechanical action can fill many of the available voids. Wet sand trapped inside the wings is far denser than dry sediment because it constantly holds seawater within its matrix. This forms a heavy internal burden inside the deteriorating metal framework, multiplying the overall weight of the structure. This environmental process radically changes the baseline engineering metrics of the wreckage. The shifting seabed does not merely cover the exterior of the aircraft to hide it from view. It can force new, uncalculated mass inside the airframe. The original factory weight specifications documented in historical records no longer apply cleanly to this structure. The aircraft has transitioned from a hollow aluminum shell into a composite object made of fragile metal, corrosion products, seawater, and compacted wet sand. Survey teams investigating the site can map the external boundary of the wreckage, but they cannot visually inspect every internal void. They verify the rear fuselage is largely absent and the forward section remains buried. However, they cannot accurately calculate how much dense coastal sediment has accumulated inside the wing roots over 81 years. The tidal environment effectively hides this weight gain beneath the surviving aluminum skin. This hidden accumulation of solid mass sets a physical trap for the recovery teams preparing to lift the structure. On April 8, 2026, operational control of the site shifted from the ocean to a civilian-led recovery team. The Hokusatsu War Heritage Preservation Society initiated the first full extraction operation after earlier survey and preparation work had already defined the target. Their objective required positioning a heavy-lift crane barge directly over the coastal resting place. However, bringing industrial salvage equipment into an extreme shallow zone introduces a severe operational boundary. The salvage vessel must maintain enough buoyancy to support both its own massive weight and the incoming wreckage without touching the seabed. That clearance requirement defines the operating clock. The barge must approach during the high tide window, hold position, complete a near vertical hoist, and leave before falling water reduces clearance. Any sideways drag through dense coastal sand could tear the deteriorating aluminum apart. Operating in a coastal surf zone means the barge is subjected to continuous wave action, which continuously threatens to disrupt this stationary position. Rigging adjustments below the surface now consume the same limited flotation time that keeps the crane platform safe. With the barge positioned during the high tide window, the divers established the initial rigging on the most accessible targets. Approximately 1 hour into the active operation, the crane brings up 2 of the 4 missing propeller blades. They are not the full propeller assembly. They are separate, recoverable pieces of the aircraft, drawn carefully from the shifting coastal sand. Extracting the propeller blades serves a specific procedural function beyond artifact collection. It gives the civilian engineering team an early check on the reach of the crane, the diver rigging, and the immediate perimeter of the debris field. It also confirms that isolated, solid components can survive a controlled vertical recovery without disintegrating under mechanical tension. Yet, lifting 2 blades provides limited predictive data regarding the much larger structures still buried below. The blades do not represent the deep internal cavities of the wings. They do not reveal the true mass trapped inside the forward airframe. As the tide begins to turn, the salvage crew shifts its primary focus to the surviving aluminum structure. The propeller recovery confirms the site, but the true load of the main aircraft remains entirely untested. When the team shifts from loose components to the primary airframe, the lift now has to carry a large object whose true load remains unproven. Divers connect the lifting gear to the strongest available structural points around the forward fuselage and the main wing attachments. The crane operator slowly draws tension on the primary lift lines to break the bottom suction. The resistance appears immediately. The load is far heavier than the planning estimate, and the weight transfers from the seabed into the extraction harness. At this moment, the combination of wet sediment and deteriorating aluminum bends the pipe supporting the lift. The support pipe distorts under the unexpected mass, compromising the load path and forcing the team to stop before the recovery architecture fails. The engineering team faces an immediate and severe trade-off edge. Forcing the lift with a distorted rig could destroy the fragile aircraft. Abandoning the lift could allow the tide and sediment to reclaim the exposed structure. The project leaders halt the crane operation long enough to reinforce the lifting gear. The operation cannot proceed without immediate mechanical adaptation. Additional pipe and lever blocks are brought in to strengthen the rig before the hoist resumes. The details belong to the recovery crew, not to a public how-to manual. What matters for the documentary is the engineering reality. The load path had to be reinforced because the airframe, packed with wet sand, weighed far more than the original plan allowed. With the reinforced harness secured, the operation resumes. The crane operator carefully increases tension, balancing the lift to ensure the heavy engine block does not break away from the weakened wing roots. The extraction moves at a highly controlled pace. The structure has to rise slowly, draining seawater and shedding loose sediment without sudden, asymmetric shifts inside the wings. After 4 hours of continuous mechanical strain, the operation reaches its crucial threshold. The heavily corroded radial engine, the intact forward armored cockpit section, and the expansive main wings finally break the surface of the water. The heavy crane meticulously swings the massive, dripping assembly over the transport barge. The crew gently lowers the reinforced frame onto the deck, securing the Shiden Kai on a dry surface for the first time in over 8 decades. The extraction from the coastal shelf is physically complete, and the primary structure is visibly intact. The airframe is finally out of the water, but its internal cavities hold a severe operational miscalculation. Before the ammunition was found, the preservation team believed the fighter had probably expended its rounds during its final combat engagement. That belief was understandable. A high-altitude interceptor fighting bomber formations could easily be assumed to have fired heavily before being forced down. But it was still only an assumption, not a verified safety baseline. 1 week after the airframe emerged from the surf zone, that assumption collapsed. On April 15, 2026, the team was removing shells, sediment, and marine growth from the recovered aircraft when the possibility of unused ammunition inside the wings became clear. The work stopped and a police-witnessed inspection confirmed a large quantity of unused rounds inside the aircraft's wing gun areas. On April 16, 2026, JGSDF personnel carried out the removal operation at the temporary storage site in Izumi. After roughly 5 hours, they recovered 712 unused 20mm rounds from the wings. After decades in saltwater, the rounds cannot be treated as ordinary debris. Their condition must be assumed hazardous until military explosive specialists remove and dispose of them. The stockpile of 20mm rounds was no longer a normal aviation ammunition load under military control. It was a hidden ordnance problem trapped inside a recovered historical artifact. During the initial salvage, the crane had lifted the wings without anyone knowing that hundreds of unused rounds remained inside. Once the ammunition was recognized, cleaning and conservation work could no longer continue as a civilian task. The airframe had to be treated first as an explosive ordnance hazard and only later as a conservation object. The sudden presence of hundreds of unused rounds forced an immediate halt to ordinary conservation work. A civilian heritage organization could not treat degraded military ammunition as a routine cleaning problem. The discovery converted a controlled historical recovery into an ordnance response. Project leaders notified the authorities. Kagoshima police took part in the inspection, and JGSDF personnel handled the recovery of the rounds. For the military specialists, historical preservation was secondary to public safety. Their task was to remove the ammunition and send it onward for disposal under state control. The civilian engineers could not resume normal conservation work around the affected wing areas until the ammunition response was complete. The initial belief that the magazines were empty had masked a serious risk during the heavy lift. Once the explosive hazard is addressed, the engineering team can return to stabilizing what remains of the historical artifact. What investigators can physically verify today is the remarkable survival of external paint layers and specific wartime mechanical damage, while the long-term chemical stability of the underlying metal remains the central problem of the conservation effort. The heavy coastal sediment that created a massive load penalty during the lifting process also performed a highly specialized protective function. When a fragile structure is rapidly buried beneath thick, wet sand, the dense material can reduce direct exposure to moving, oxygen-rich seawater. That protection is imperfect. Chlorides still attack aluminum alloys, and corrosion can continue inside crevices, joints, and contact points. But burial and sediment may have slowed some exposure-related deterioration, helping fragile surface details survive far longer than they might have in open surf. Because sediment burial appears to have protected parts of the wreck, surface details survived the harsh marine environment in remarkable condition. As conservation technicians removed tightly packed layers of sediment and marine growth, they revealed the red sun insignias, the Hinomaru, still visible on the wing panels. Beyond paint preservation, the wreck also carried physical damage consistent with its reported final combat. Japanese reporting described marks on the propeller thought to be bullet damage from aerial combat. These gouges and scars do not, by themselves, prove every detail of the historical account. They do something more cautious and more powerful. They align the recovered metal with the story of an interceptor that fought, was hit, and came down in the coastal water off Akune. With the physical evidence documented and the structure removed from the coast, the immediate marine operation reached its conclusion. The primary objective shifted from mechanical extraction to long-term stabilization. The preserved forward fuselage, the heavy radial engine, and the main wing sections were secured for overland handling after the recovery. The aircraft was brought to the Izumi area, with Kominotsu Port serving as the landing point before the next phase of conservation. Pulling an 81-year-old metal artifact from seawater into the open atmosphere introduces an immediate chemical threat. If salt-soaked aluminum is simply left to dry, chlorides can accelerate corrosion and damage already weakened material. To slow that process, the conservation plan calls for desalination over roughly 1 year, removing salt from the metal in a controlled way before the aircraft can be stabilized for future display. The public details do not confirm every bath chemistry or monitoring interval, but they do confirm the essential conservation problem. The lift ended the marine recovery, not the preservation work. The successful extraction and ongoing stabilization of the Wakimoto aircraft fundamentally alters the global inventory of surviving World War II aviation architecture. With the addition of this recovered fuselage and wing structure, Japanese reporting counts 5 known surviving Shiden Kai examples, or substantial remains worldwide, with 2 now in Japan. The Akune aircraft is not an intact museum fighter in the usual sense. It is a rare recovered combat wreck, incomplete, damaged, and chemically unstable, but historically irreplaceable. The completion of this project proves that strict engineering discipline can overcome severe coastal extraction hazards, transforming a highly vulnerable marine wreck into a candidate for permanent conservation.